The first indication I had that something was amiss was a page on my pager that said, "This is no joke. A plane has hit the World Trade Center." I was assigned to go to New York, and instead ended up at the Pentagon. Obviously, I think like everybody, I wondered, trying to put your arms around what was going on, because it didn't fit into any of the models of stories that we'd covered before or events that we'd covered before. And it seemed haphazard and wildly violent. One of the things about covering the events at the Pentagon were we didn't come face to face with victims as reporters did in New York at Ground Zero. There was more of a distance to covering it. It wasn't as an immediate situation. And I do recall seeing a video feed a couple days after September 11th, when President Bush and his wife visited the burn center at Washington Hospital and met with some of the people who were inside the Pentagon and who were burned. And I remember very clearly the president coming out of that, quite shaken. It appears as he'd been crying, and that was unusual for that president. And I never quite understood what had happened inside the hospital, and there had been very tight coverage of what happened in the hospital. 6 months or so later, we did a follow-up story with one of the burn victims who was still recovering from his wounds, and I met him, and he talked about meeting the president during that period, and he had been burned quite severely and was all bandaged and could barely move, and his life was still in some jeopardy. And he described for me the moment when the president came into his room, and as a member of the military, his initial response was that he had to salute his commander-in-chief, and through his bandages he tried to raise his arm to his head, and he couldn't quite get it up past his shoulder. But it was at that moment, he said, the president became quite emotional, and obviously so did he. And later, it kind of all made sense that what had happened inside that hospital was that moment. And that was perhaps the moment that it was, even 6 months later, it was driven home to me what had happened inside that building that day, because talking with victims gives you an insight that all the pictures and all the press briefings can never do.